My father's voice came through the phone like a command clipped and cold, not even a pause for breath. Don't bring up your rank. Just sit in the back and don't embarrass your brother. That was it. No hello? No how was the flight? No. I'm glad you're coming home after 14 years. Just an order as if I were still some teenager with too much mouth and too little worth, not a decorated officer flying in from DC for a family military tribute. I stood in the terminal at Bluegrass Regional Airport, phone pressed to my ear, the other hand, gripping the strap of my duffel bag. The air smelled like old jet fuel and fried chicken. Kentucky hadn't changed, but I had. I was no longer Evelyn, who followed orders without blinking. I was Commander Evelyn Rhodes. Not that he ever used my title. I didn't come to talk, Dad, I said, keeping my voice even. I came because it's a tribute to Mum's side too. And Aunt Miriam asked me personally. There was a pause then, the sound of him exhaling sharply, like I'd interrupted a schedule. She shouldn't have. But what's done is done. Just remember, this isn't the place for tech folks to play dress-up. He hung up before I could respond. Of course he did. Always the last word. I lowered the phone, slipped it into my coat pocket, and walked outside, into the bite of late autumn. The cold snapped against my skin like memory. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The car rental guy didn't even ask for my name, just smiled as I stepped in. You here for the tribute? He asked. Big Rhodes family thing, right? I gave a neutral nod. Your dad's a legend around here, he continued. Colonel Rhodes, Vietnam. Right. Yes, I said. He beamed. Bet he's proud you're coming home. I didn't correct him, didn't tell him that pride was never part of the Rhodes family vocabulary. My father was proud of one thing, my brother Derek. Infantry officer, Bronze Star, combat tours, the real soldier by his measure. Me, I sat in classified command rooms and fought battles through screens. Support staff, he used to call me, even to my face. I pulled out of the lot in silence. No music, just the hum of tyres on familiar roads, flag-draped porches, steeples worn by weather, the same two-lane road leading back to the house I used to call home. I slowed down when I reached the Rhodes place, a white colonial with navy shutters and a flagpole in the yard. But I didn't stop. I wasn't staying there. I had a room at a motel 2 miles away, clean, anonymous, detached. At check-in, the clerk barely glanced up. Welcome back, she said, like everyone else somehow knew I was returning, for reasons that weren't celebration. Once inside, I dropped my bag, sat on the edge of the bed and stared out the window. Through the sheer curtain, I could see the tops of the oaks that lined the old base road. Somewhere beyond those trees, in a nondescript bunker, lived a defense protocol. I had designed one that had intercepted a code injection, mid-breach, saving hundreds of lives. I wasn't just some tech, I wasn't support. I was Commander Evelyn Rhodes, Director of Integrated Cyber Response. But tomorrow at that tribute, I'd be introduced, if introduced at all, as my daughter. Evelyn, she works with computers now. I'd let it go. I'd nod. Because I wasn't here to fight. I was here to finish something. When I was a kid, we had a wall in the living room we called the Honor Wall. Rows of black and white photos. Grandpa in his navy whites. Dad in fatigues next to a chopper. And Derek, so many of Derek. Boot camp officer school medals, his purple heart in the centre, framed by Mum herself. Mine, a thumbtacked photo from Basic. No frame. Behind the door. Like a permission slip that got misplaced. I hadn't thought of that wall in years, but sitting on the edge of that motel bed, I could see it perfectly. The empty space where pride should have lived. The outline of what never made it to the frame. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked down to the vending machine, pressed my palm against the cold glass. Out of habit, I checked my phone. No messages. Not from Dad, not from Derek, not even a see you tomorrow. It didn't sting the way it used to. It just confirmed the landscape. The silence was familiar, like walking barefoot on old carpet. I had lived in the background so long I knew how to move without creaking the floor. I remembered something Mum said once years ago when I told her I was being promoted. She had smiled, then whispered like it was a prayer, "Don't let them put your story in someone else's frame." Evie. Back then, I didn't understand what she meant. Now I did. She wasn't talking about picture frames. She was talking about power, voice, place, and what happens when you give them away. The next morning, before the tribute, I stood outside the community centre watching people file in. Church ladies with red, white and blue scarves. Retired Marines with faded tattoos. The world my father belonged to, that he ruled like a ghost colonel. I straightened my coat, pulled out the folded paper in my pocket, the invitation Aunt Miriam had sent. It was the only official document that had acknowledged I belonged. I walked through the doors, and every step felt like threading a needle. I didn't come home to be seen. I came home to make sure they never forgot what they chose not to see. The scent of cinnamon rolls and old church pews hit me first. Nostalgic but slightly stale, like something preserved more for memory than meaning. Inside the community centre, every corner was decorated with red, white and blue. Mannequins dressed in old uniforms stood like silent sentinels. Corkboards displayed timelines and family trees all tracing the Rhodes military lineage like scripture carved in cardboard. I scanned for something, anything that resembled me, but all I saw were names that stopped just short of mine. I hadn't been back to this town in over a decade, but everything looked the same. The benches, the banners, even the way people spoke with the weight of tradition on their tongues. What had changed were the people, the way they looked through me instead of at me, like I was a ghost walking through the halls of a myth I didn't quite belong to. Aunt Miriam waved to me from across the room. Her smile was tight, nervous, the kind you give before a confession or an apology. Next to her stood a little girl, bright eyes, curly hair, no more than 10. "That's your great niece," Abby Miriam whispered when I walked over. "Derek's youngest." Abby tilted her head, staring at me with curiosity, unfiltered by politeness. "Are you really in the army?" she asked, not rudely, just honestly. I crouched a little, meeting her eye. "I am." She blinked. "Like, for real, like with guns and stuff?" Her tone wasn't mocking. It was wonder and something softer, uncertainty. "Not with guns," I said gently. "With systems, with signals. But yes, for real." Abby glanced at Miriam, then back at me. "Daddy said you just worked with computers. That's not really the army, right?" Miriam froze. My jaw clenched, but I smiled at the child. "Sometimes the most important soldiers don't carry weapons. They carry decisions." Abby didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway. "Cool," she said. "I like your boots." I stood, heart heavier than it should have been from a simple conversation with a child. But that's how it always started. Quiet rewrites, whispered beliefs, until your whole narrative got assigned to the background. After an hour of forced pleasantries and name tags that spelled my name wrong, I slipped out the side door and drove to the cemetery. I hadn't been to her grave since the funeral. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much. The headstone stood modest but polished, surrounded by leaves that had gathered like offerings. Helen Rhodes, it read etched in clean serif font. Beloved wife of Colin Raymond Rhodes, mother of Capt. Derek Rhodes. That was it. As if her world had ended with their names. As if I had never existed. My throat tightened, not with tears, but with clarity. Even here, even in death, I was an omission. I knelt beside the stone, brushing away the dried leaves with my sleeve. "Hi, Mom," I whispered. I made it. The silence was immediate, but not empty. It felt like her soft, strong, and everywhere. "You're not on the plaque," I said aloud. "And neither am I." I let that truth sit heavy and still. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the photo I always kept me and her on the porch, summer light in our eyes, lemonade in hand. I slid it behind one of the small flower vases facing inward. "We remember us," I said, "even if no one else does." I stayed for a while watching shadows shift across the grass. At one point, someone else arrived, a couple from town, I think, but they didn't approach. Just glanced, then moved along. I suppose I looked like part of the scenery now. That suited me fine. On the drive back, I passed the old baseball field where Derek used to practice, and I used to sit holding stats sheets and sunscreen. He was always the star. I was the support. Funny how even back then, the roles had already been assigned, but I remembered one game just won where he twisted his ankle and couldn't play. Coach asked me to keep score. I did more than that. I called signals from the dugout, tracked pitcher tendencies, and we won. No one thanked me, not even Derek. But I remembered. And now, that memory felt like fuel. As I pulled into the motel lot again, my phone buzzed unknown number. I didn't answer, just stared at the screen until it faded to black. I wasn't in the mood for cryptic texts or last-minute apologies. Not today. Not after seeing Mum's name standing alone like a chapter cut short. Back in the room, I sat on the edge of the bed again. Same spot, same posture, but I wasn't the same. The line from the community centre echoed in my head, Abby's voice clear and unsure. "That's not really the army, right?" I whispered back into the silence. "It's more than they'll ever know." Then I looked toward the mirror. For a moment, I didn't see the uniform or the rank. I saw the little girl who used to line up plastic soldiers across her bedroom floor, then quietly put them away when her brother walked in. That girl was still here, but she wasn't putting anything away anymore. She zipped up her coat, squared her shoulders, and walked straight into the Lion's Den, the Beckley Community Centre, dressed up like a slice of 4th of July nostalgia. The parking lot was already full minivans and pickups sporting faded military decals. A banner hung above the entrance Rhodes family legacy, honouring 3 generations of service. The word legacy did a lot of work, I thought. It covered the parts people wanted to remember and quietly erased the rest. Inside, the air buzzed with over-polished pride. Patriotic music played over the speakers, soft brass and strings, the kind that made people feel reverent without thinking too hard. Rows of folding chairs faced a makeshift stage framed in bunting. Tables lined the sides with trays of deviled egg sugar cookies in the shape of flags and pitchers of sweet tea sweating under the lights. And there he was, Derek, my brother, centre stage, smiling like a man who'd never known doubt, dressed in full, formal blues ribbons, polished boots shining. He stood under the spotlight with the ease of someone who had always been told the light belonged to him. People clapped as he spoke, not just politely, genuinely. He had that effect. He looked like everything a tribute was supposed to be about. I stayed near the back, pretending to check my phone, pretending I wasn't counting the seconds until someone noticed I didn't fit. Aunt Miriam saw me and gave a small wave, hesitant, like she wasn't sure which version of me had shown up today. The decorated officer or the invisible daughter? I offered a nod, nothing more. Then I saw him. Luke Carmichael, high school sweetheart. First kiss behind the bleachers, now husband of my former best friend Sarah. His hair was thinner, his stomach softer, but the grin hadn't changed. He made his way over with the easy confidence of someone who never wondered if they were welcome. Evero, he said, using a nickname no one had called me in years. Man, it's been 15 years. 14 I corrected, then instantly regretted it. He laughed like that was charming. Heard you're working in DC, now still in IT. The way he said it like IT was a local dog grooming gig. I kept my tone polite. Cyber Command, I said. National Infrastructure Security. He raised his eyebrows. Wow, tech stuff, huh? That's impressive. Really? Sarah always said you were like super smart. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. Thanks. Good to see you, Luke. He nodded and drifted back toward the cookie table, unaware he'd just flattened my entire career into a cute compliment. I moved to one of the tables near the entrance where printed programs were stacked in neat little piles. I picked one up already bracing. The cover showed an old family photo, Grandpa in uniform, Dad in his prime, Derek saluting. No surprise there. I flipped to the second page where they listed attending family members and their affiliations. My breath caught. Evelyn Rhodes, IT assistant, 1 typo, 1 demotion. And just like that, my presence was both acknowledged and erased in the same sentence. I stared at it so long, the letters started to blur. Someone behind me cleared their throat and I snapped the program closed. I found a seat near the back beside a ficus plant that looked as tired as I felt. Around me, people murmured about deployments and medals about sons who'd made them proud. Not a single person asked what I did. Not a single one noticed the rank on my badge. They didn't see me, not really. Just a shadow in boots and a coat that didn't fit their narrative. When Derek took the stage for his speech, the applause thundered. He spoke with confidence, with practiced pauses and heartfelt inflections. Family, he said, is about duty, honour, and sacrifice. Heads nodded all around me. I wondered if he believed it, or if he just liked how it sounded. He talked about Dad's legacy, about Grandpa's time at sea, about his own tours and what it meant to serve. He never mentioned his sister. Not once, not even as a footnote. I looked down at the program again, the words IT assistant staring back like a smirk. I could feel something inside me coil not in rage, but in resolve. They weren't just mislabeling me, they were defining me in the terms most convenient to them. And I'd let them for years, but not anymore. Not now that I'd heard my great-niece ask if I was a real soldier. Not now that I'd seen my mother's headstone reduce her to someone else's wife. The line ends here, I thought. This story may not have started with me, but it damn well won't end without me. I folded the program and tucked it beneath my chair, letting my fingers rest in my lap, calm on the outside, but vibrating just beneath the skin. Conversations swirled around me, football scores, base gossip, the best flavour of MREs. People buzzed about Derek's speech, how proud Dad must be. I heard my name once mispronounced, of course, then let the rest dissolve like sugar in water. My cousin Lucille slid into the seat beside me, with a paper plate full of potato salad and red punch. She was always sweet, the kind who remembered birthdays and brought pies to funerals. "You look sharp, Evelyn," she said. "Real professional." "Thank you," I replied, my voice clipped, but not cold. She hesitated, then leaned in her voice, dropping to a whisper, like we were conspirators. "You know, even if they don't say it out loud, people respect you. But, I mean, you're a woman. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." "Not really." She smiled as if she'd given a compliment. I looked at her for a long second. She meant well, which somehow made it worse. "Respect isn't respect if it's silent," I said. Her brow furrowed slightly. "I didn't mean I know," I cut in gently. "You meant it kindly." "That's the problem." She didn't reply, just offered a sad little nod and focused on her potato salad. Across the room, the honour wall stood like a shrine, laminated photos, polished plaques, curated nostalgia. I made my way toward it slow and steady, like I was walking toward a truth I already knew but needed to feel in my bones. There was Grandpa in black and white, stoic in navy dress. Dad in jungle fatigues, a cigarette hanging loose from his fingers. Derek in multiple poses, receiving his Bronze Star, standing tall in combat gear, grinning on some overseas base. There was even one of him and Dad at a flag-raising ceremony. The captions beneath glowed with reverence. Service, valor, leadership. I stepped closer, scanning the rows. I'd remembered where mine used to be, third row down just left of the centre. A candid shot in front of a command-tent sun in my eyes, a headset at my neck. Not posed, not polished, but mine. And now it was gone. Just empty space. I stared at the blank patch on the corkboard like it might blink first. But nothing happened. Nothing moved. I pressed my lips together, not out of sadness, but out of sheer calculation. That photo wasn't missing by accident. It had been removed. The last time I saw it there, I had been 24, back from my first overseas assignment. They hosted a barbecue in the backyard, all plastic chairs and store-brand lemonade. Derek had just returned from deployment wounded, but glowing with the kind of admiration you could bottle. Mum had made ribs. Aunt Miriam brought deviled eggs. I wore my new uniform crisp and still unfamiliar on my body, like it was borrowed. I remembered standing near the folding table holding a tray of drinks, smiling too much, speaking too little. Dad had called for silence, lifted a paper cup and toasted to Derek's bravery. Everyone clapped. No one mentioned I'd returned that same week from coordinating a multi-unit response that de-escalated a full cyber siege. I served lemonade while Derek received a salute. In the photo they took that day, I stood to the side, partially cropped. But Mum had framed it anyway, tucked it on the wall with a note taped to the back. To our daughter, with pride. I had seen her do it late one night when she thought I was asleep. Her quiet way of balancing scales. I wondered now what happened to that frame. If it got boxed up when she passed, or tossed the moment Dad decided it no longer fit the family myth. I stepped back from the wall, letting the images blur into each other. Somewhere behind me, someone laughed, an old family friend, probably recalling a training mishap or field story. I didn't turn around. I just kept staring at the hole where my photo should have been. And in that moment, I remembered that girl, 17, wearing a too-stiff JAR-OTC uniform, at some other tribute holding a tray of lemonade and pretending the sweetness didn't burn on the way down. She had stood in corners, smiled on command, waited to be noticed. But she wasn't waiting anymore. I was done waiting. I walked a slow circuit around the honour wall again, not because I needed to find myself, but because I needed to see what remained, what little scrap of history had been tolerated enough to survive erasure. And there it was, bottom corner near the baseboard where dust clung like shame. A blurry photo, sun-bleached, awkwardly cropped. Me. Or at least a version of me helmet, on standing near a comms tower holding a tablet. The caption beneath read, "Support Staff, E. Rhodes." My jaw locked. Not captain, not commander, not even the correct full name. Just E. Rhodes reduced to support, like I'd handed out headsets and kept the coffee hot. I stared at that small passive lie like it had punched me, but it didn't hurt the way it used to. It rang hollow. It felt weak, because I knew the truth. I'd lived it quietly in places they'd never stepped foot in, behind walls they didn't even know existed. My mind drifted uninvited, but crystal clear to a night 12 years ago. Kandahar. 4:03 a.m, the first time I walked into a classified ops room and didn't feel like an intruder. I was 26, the youngest by nearly a decade. Everyone else in that space wore age and fatigue like armour. I wore a badge that didn't open every door, but opened enough. A commander's eyes had scanned the room and landed on me. "You're the systems lead?" he asked, one eyebrow cocked. "Yes, sir," I said, standing straighter than I needed to. "Good. Then tell us how we stop this breach in under 7 minutes or we're toast." And I did. Not with bravado, not with barking, but with precision. I'd studied the network architecture for weeks, knew which redundancies were most likely to fail, where latency had been a problem in the last drill. I issued commands like I'd been doing it for years. They listened. Not because I demanded respect, but because in that moment I was the only one who saw the whole board. When we traced the intrusion, locked down the loop, and confirmed zero exfiltration, no one cheered. There was no back-patting. Just silence and nods. The kind of nods that meant she's one of us now. Back at the tribute, the fluorescent light flickered above the display. No one around me knew about that night, about that mission, about the dozen others that followed, each one more high stakes than the last. And no one cared, because here in this room, if you didn't carry a rifle or bleed visibly, your stories didn't count. I took out my phone and pulled up the secure folder photos, after action reports, internal commendations. I'd never shown them to anyone in this town, partly because I wasn't allowed, mostly because I knew they'd only nod politely, then go back to talking about real war. But staring at that miscaptioned photo now, I felt something settle into place, not rage, not grief, just clarity. I didn't need to convince them. I needed to correct the record. I leaned down, opened my bag, and found the envelope I'd brought just in case. I slipped a document from it, clean printed, framed in the language of fact. Commander Evelyn Rhodes, Joint Cyber Command Operation Resolute Shield, Coordinating Officer. I walked to the display, reached beneath the flimsy plastic holder, and taped it directly under the miscaptioned photo. A few people glanced my way, confused. One woman, the church secretary, I think, squinted at the new label. "Didn't know you were a commander," she murmured. "Now you do," I replied without turning. I lingered at the display longer than I meant to, not because I was still looking for something, but because I realized finally there was nothing else left to find. My story wasn't forgotten. It had been deliberately pruned, like a branch that didn't fit the shape of the tree. They kept what looked good on paper and trimmed what made them uncomfortable. It didn't surprise me anymore, but it still stunned in a quiet, bitter way. I stood there listening to the room behind me swell with laughter and fork clinks, and thought, this is how erasure happens. Not through violence, through omission, through indifference. Someone walked past me, a man in a faded vet cap. He glanced at the photo, then at my nameplate, then at me. "Support staff, huh?" he said with a crooked smile. Not cruel, but not kind either. I didn't flinch. "Not exactly," I said. "Commander," he blinked, surprised. "Well, I'll be. They got that label wrong then." I didn't answer. He walked on, shrugging, sipping coffee. I stayed rooted, and in that silence my memory reached further back to a conversation with my mother. I was 18, just been accepted into a direct commission program after college. I'd brought home the acceptance letter, barely containing my joy. My father looked at the paper like it had insulted him. "You're skipping the real path," he'd said. "You're jumping ranks on paper. That's not how real leaders are made." I'd looked to Mom, who met my eyes for a second too long, and said nothing. Later that night, she came to my room while I packed. She sat on the edge of my bed, fingers clasped tight. "You know what you're doing?" she asked softly. "I think so," I said. "Then go be better than what they expect." Quiet doesn't mean small. I hadn't understood then what she meant, but I do now. And still, standing there in front of that outdated photo, I knew this wasn't just about me. It was about every woman who'd been cropped out of the shot, every quiet genius whose name got buried under someone else's legacy. I pressed the new caption flat with the palm of my hand, like sealing something sacred. I wasn't stealing spotlight. I was correcting history. Behind me, I caught sight of Derek in conversation with the mayor, casual and polished, full of that effortless confidence of men who never had to fight to be believed. Dad hovered nearby, chest-puffed eyes alert, glancing at me only when he thought I wouldn't notice. But I did. He looked at me like someone expecting disruption. And maybe, for the first time, that wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a warning. because I wasn't going to let this moment pass into silence. Not anymore. And as if the universe had finally caught up with my resolve, the double doors at the far end of the hall creaked open. Not dramatically, not with flair, but with the kind of quiet weight that makes even the air pause. A few heads turned, distracted by the shift in light, the slight change in pressure. Then more turned. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Laughter stalled in half-breaths. Because walking through those doors wasn't a neighbour or some straggling cousin late from the parking lot. It was General Alden Voss, in full-dress uniform ribbons sharp against his chest, gaze steady like a compass that never learned to bend. For a second, the room didn't know how to respond. Veterans stiffened reflexively. A few people began to clap, unsure of protocol. Derek, who'd been mid-story with someone from the city council, straightened and stepped forward, instinctively smile already forming. Of course, he thought it was for him. Why wouldn't he? In this room, he was the chosen one, the decorated son, the face that fit the frame. Dad was already adjusting his collar, eyes gleaming with the kind of pride I hadn't seen directed at me since I learned to tie my own shoes. But General Voss didn't stop at Derek. He didn't even glance in his direction. He walked past the family photo collage, past the exhibit table, past the podium where Dad had just rehearsed his closing remarks. He walked straight to me. "Commander Rhodes," he said, voice crisp but warm, carrying with ease over the room's stunned silence. "An honour to see you again." Every breath in the room stalled. I rose slowly, not out of hesitation, but with the kind of control I had earned. I took his hand firmly. "General, I wasn't expecting you." He nodded, smiling faintly. "That's how I prefer to arrive." He turned toward the crowd, then voice clear as a bell. For those who may not be familiar, Commander Evelyn Rhodes led the Cyber Integrated Response Unit during Operation Resolute Shield, an initiative that neutralized multi-theater threats across 4 continents. Her leadership directly contributed to the preservation of over a dozen critical assets in Allied territories. Gasps whispered like wind through dry grass. Someone dropped a plastic fork. A woman clutched her husband's sleeve. Derek's mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. Dad had stopped moving altogether, his jaw, tight shoulders suddenly too square. General Voss continued. "When I heard there would be a tribute to the Rhodes family, I asked to attend. Because when history looks back on 21st century defense strategy, Commander Rhodes' name won't be in the footnotes, it will be in the doctrine." I stood still, barely breathing. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I knew what this moment was. It wasn't vindication, it wasn't revenge, it was restoration. The record was being corrected not by noise, not by confrontation, but by fact. And facts, when spoken aloud by the right voice, became impossible to ignore. The general looked at me once more. "Your presence at this table was far too quiet, Commander. That ends today." And then, without flinching, without theatrics, he saluted. I returned it with precision. The silence around us was total, reverent. And then slowly, others stood. A few other officers, some younger veterans, an elderly Marine with shaking hands. They saluted too. Not because of rank, not because of orders. Because the story had changed. General Voss gave one last nod, shook my hand again and turned to leave. As he passed, "Dad," there was an exchange. Brief, hushed. I didn't hear the words. I didn't need to. Whatever was said stayed behind on Dad's expression, cracked pride, strained composure, something like defeat, wearing politeness like a mask. The doors closed behind the general, with the same quiet power they had opened. I turned not to bask in the room's stunned quiet, but to walk away from it. Because I had never needed their applause, only their awareness. After General Voss walked out, the room didn't exactly return to normal. You can't unring a bell, Conversations resumed, but they were fractured, faltering in mid-thought. People glanced sideways, whispered things behind coffee cups. I moved quietly back toward the display wall, past the folding chairs still warm from stunned bodies. My heart wasn't pounding. It was steady, calm, like the air after a storm that never fully broke but still rewrote the sky. I reached the corner of the exhibit where my mislabeled photo had been left to yellow, the one that said Support Staff, E. Rhodes, as if that summed up a decade of classified missions. Sleepless nights and choices that changed the course of conflicts most civilians didn't even know happened. From my bag, I took the corrected label I'd brought: Commander Evelyn Rhodes, Operation Talon Shield, Strategic Lead. The adhesive peeled off with a gentle snap. I pressed the new placard into place with both hands firm and certain. No one tried to stop me. No one even moved. They just watched, which somehow felt like more than I'd ever gotten from them before. Behind me, footsteps, slow, hesitant. I turned and saw a young soldier, maybe 23 if that. Clean cut nervous in his dress blues. He looked like he hadn't decided whether to salute or speak. I gave a nod, letting him off the hook. He stepped forward anyway. "Ma'am," he said, voice cracking slightly. "I just wanted to say you were the reason I joined Cyber Command. We read about Operation Talon Shield in training. They said the mission lead was anonymous. But today I saw who she was. Thank you." He extended his hand. I shook it firm but not formal. "You're the reason we do this." I said and meant it. He looked like he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Instead, he nodded once sharp and respectful and stepped back into the crowd. The video spread faster than I thought it would. By the next morning, someone had uploaded a clip of General Voss's speech to a veterans forum. From there, it was picked up by a military podcast, then a think piece blog, then Twitter. I didn't post it, didn't even comment. But I saw the ripple take shape. Quiet, controlled, like the work itself. Someone tagged me in a thread. The woman standing at the edge of the room turned out to be the one who held the centre all along. It didn't go viral in the way celebrity gossip or scandal does. It went viral like water seeps through cracks, slow, patient, unstoppable. Other women started sharing their own stories in the replies. Tech sergeants, naval intel, logistics chiefs, all the ones who had been told in so many words, "You're helpful, but not heroic." The chorus grew not loud, but deep. And in the middle of it, my name finally used with the right title, the right history. That night, I sat alone in my motel room, staring at the screen, watching the views climb. Not with pride, exactly. With relief. Like someone had been holding their breath for a decade and finally exhaled. The tribute may have been local, but its echo wasn't. And neither was the silence that followed. Because silence, I learned, isn't empty. It carries weight. It holds everything they didn't say, everything I hadn't said until now. And sometimes it says more than applause ever could. Later that evening, I took a walk through the town's quiet streets, still wearing my uniform, my shoes clicking softly on the old sidewalks. Christmas lights blinked lazily on porches, and the scent of chimney smoke lingered in the air. A teenager on a bike slowed beside me, squinting in recognition. "Hey," he said, almost shy. "You're the lady from the video, right? The one with the general?" I nodded. "That's me." He gave a small grin. "That was badass." "Thanks," I replied and kept walking, my smile laced with something more than amusement, something like quiet justice. When I passed the church where my mother used to sing in the choir, I stopped, looked up at the windows glowing gold with candlelight. I hadn't stepped inside in years, but I stood there feeling her presence anyway, as if somewhere somehow she had seen today unfold, as if she had orchestrated a bit of it from whatever place mothers go when they're too strong to vanish. My phone buzzed again, a message this time. No name, just a number. Saw the clip. Took long enough for them to get it right. Proud of you. It wasn't signed, but I knew it was from my old commanding officer in Frankfurt, the one who had handed me my first operational unit. I stared at the message for a long moment, then closed the phone, tucked it back in my pocket. The wind picked up. Not cold, just crisp. Like it was clearing space. I took a breath and kept walking. Not back toward the motel. Toward the field behind the old high school where I used to run drills in ROTC, where Derek used to lap me and laugh. The field was empty now, overgrown. But I walked its edge, pacing like a soldier, steady like a leader, quiet like a revolution. This time, I wasn't remembering. I was reclaiming. The next morning, the air felt heavier. Not with regret, but with readiness. I knew the conversation I had avoided for over a decade was no longer optional. Derek found me in the community hall alone near the display table. The others had gone home or were lingering in the parking lot, basking in borrowed echoes. He didn't say my name at first, just walked up with his hands in his pockets, the way he did when we were kids, and he knew he'd broken something but hadn't decided whether to admit it. "You made your point," he said, not unkindly, but with that Rhodes edge, the tone that assumed control even when he had none. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch between us until it grew taut. "Did I finally asked, because I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was correcting the record." He shifted uncomfortably. "You could have told me about the operation, all of it. I was blindsided." I turned to face him fully, letting the weight of years settle in my shoulders. "You weren't blindsided, Derek. You were unprepared. There's a difference." He bristled just slightly. Then his voice softened like peeling away armor. "You were always sharper, faster. Even in ROTC, I just didn't know how to live with that." There it was, the unspoken truth finally surfacing. "You knew," I said, voice low. "You just didn't know how to share the spotlight." His mouth opened, then closed. No denial, no protest, just the smallest nod. "You wanted to be the one everyone turned to," I continued. "The picture on the mantle, the story at dinner. But wanting recognition without owning the responsibility, that's not honor, Derek. That's theatre." He looked away, jaw tight. "It wasn't just me. Dad. He built the story. I just lived in it." I stepped closer. "And what did you do when you realized the story didn't have room for me, when you saw the medal disappear, the photo taken down?" His voice cracked. "I told myself it was politics, that it wasn't my place to interfere." I stared at him unsparing. "And now," he finally met my gaze, "now I know silence was complicity." I nodded once sharply. "Then say it. To them, not just to me." A long beat passed. He didn't say yes, but he didn't walk away. Outside, the air was warming, the chill softening under a reluctant sun. Derek and I walked side by side, no longer in step, but not in conflict. It wasn't reconciliation. Not yet. But it was the start of something more honest. Later that day, at the town diner where everyone eventually ended up, I saw him pause mid-conversation with an old sergeant. He looked across the room at me, then at the crowd, then raised his voice just enough to carry. "My sister," he said, "is the reason half of us are still here. If you don't know what she did, ask. And if you think it doesn't matter because it wasn't done with boots in sand, then you haven't been paying attention to how wars are fought today." Chairs stilled. Coffee cups hovered mid-air. No one clapped. But they listened. And that finally was enough. He joined me afterward by the corner booth. The diner's windows glowed golden with late afternoon sun. He slid into the seat opposite me and stirred his coffee, though he didn't add anything to it. "You remember that mission in Qatar? he asked quietly. I didn't answer immediately. That word still ached in my chest. I know, he said. It was my fault. I froze, gave the wrong call. The convoy delayed, and you patched the whole thing before the news ever knew. I studied him. This was the first time he'd ever acknowledged it. I didn't fix it to protect you, I said. I did it because there were lives on the line. I would have done the same for any commander. He gave a hollow laugh, and Dad buried it like it never happened. I should have stopped him. I leaned back. It wasn't your job to stop him, but it was your choice to go along with it. He nodded, eyes glassy now. I'm sorry, Ev, not for being the golden boy, for letting you carry the weight of my mistakes. It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get, and for now it was enough, because this time the truth had spoken first. But the truth, once invited, demands more than whispers. It demands daylight. I stood in the back of the community hall as people milled about, some still finishing off slices of lemon cake, others quietly glancing my way, then quickly looking elsewhere. Dad sat at a folding table near the stage, chatting with Mr. Talbot from the City Council, his voice calm, rehearsed, as if nothing had changed, as if the General's visit was just another guest in a long line of faces that came and went. But this time, I didn't stay silent. I walked slowly toward the front, envelope in hand. Each step cut through the air like a key into a long locked door. The hall seemed quieter, like it knew what was coming. Derek stood at the edge of the room, arms folded, jaw tight, watching, but not intervening. When I reached Dad, he turned with a familiar, tight-lipped smile, the one that always meant control. Evelyn, he said, rising. That was quite a moment earlier. You should have told me the General was coming. We could have framed it better. I didn't sit. I didn't smile. I placed the envelope on the table in front of him and kept my hand on it. We're not reframing anything this time. He blinked, caught off guard. What is this? I opened the envelope slowly, deliberately. From it, I pulled out a single printed document, yellowed slightly from time but sharp with memory. At the top, the Pentagon seal. Subject line, Medal of Commendation nomination. Commander Evelyn Rhodes. Murmurs began to spread low at first, like a wind threading its way through suspicion. I held the letter up, reading aloud. As requested by the family liaison, the nomination for Commander Evelyn Rhodes has been formally withdrawn to avoid reputational conflicts within internal chain of command structures. The directive reflects concern that public acknowledgement of Commander Rhodes's role in the Qatar incident may negatively impact perceptions surrounding Captain Derek Rhodes's prior deployment record. The silence afterward wasn't stunned, it was stunned into shame. People stared. A few gasped. One elderly vet quietly muttered, Jesus, I looked down at my father. You didn't protect me, I said, my voice unwavering. You protected a version of this family you could control. He swallowed, hard eyes darting around. This isn't the place, Evelyn. It's exactly the place, I said. You chose this room, this crowd, to parade your definition of honour. I'm choosing it too, to undo your silence. Derek took a step forward, but stopped. His shoulders slumped slightly, like a man watching a door finally swing open after years of pretending it was locked. I turned back to the room. For those of you who don't know, Operation Iron Crescent in Qatar was nearly compromised due to a delayed command transfer. That delay put multiple lives at risk, including Captain Rhodes. I was assigned to intercept and realign the threat within 46 minutes. My team succeeded in 39. A few heads nodded, those who understood military timing, who knew the cost of minutes in war. But instead of acknowledging what happened, I continued. My name was struck from the report. The commendation I was due was buried. Not because I failed, but because my success made someone else's failure too obvious. Dad looked stricken now, like the words themselves had weight, and this time they landed. You talk about honour, about legacy? I said, softer now, but sharper too. But what legacy are you building when it's built on a mission? Aunt Grace put her hand over her mouth. Eyes wet, Uncle Jim shifted uncomfortably. Even Mrs. Delaney, the same one who once told me women should stick to nursing, was staring at the floor. I stepped back, letting the paper rest on the table like an unwrapped truth. You could have stood beside me. Instead, you stood in front of me. And when people asked about your daughter, you gave them a version you could manage. But I am not a version. I am not support staff. I am not someone else's footnote. I didn't wait for applause. I didn't look for it. As I walked away, Derek caught my sleeve gently. Evelyn, he said, voice low, thick. I didn't know. I met his eyes. That's the thing, Derek. You didn't ask. Outside, the air was colder than I remembered. But I breathed it in like clarity, and for the first time, I didn't wonder whether my name would ever belong on their wall. Because now I had carved it into something bigger, the truth. But sometimes, truth leaves behind echoes, and I needed to hear one more voice, one that had been silent far too long. I drove down the quiet street toward the house I once called home. The shutters were still blue, the siding still white, the same crack on the front step, where I'd once tripped on the way to a Girl Scout meeting. Dad wasn't home. Derek wasn't either. That was part of the plan. I wasn't here for confrontation. I parked 2 houses down and walked the rest of the way, keys still on the old lanyard from the academy, worn frayed but still fitting in the lock like time hadn't passed. Inside, it smelled like old wood polish and something faintly sweet, maybe lemon oil. I moved through the hallway, slowly passing the photo wall that had stopped before me. No new frame had been added, just empty space. I didn't stop to stare. I'd already stopped trying to belong there. Instead, I walked toward the back of the house, the sewing room. Mum had always called it her corner of order. I used to sit on the floor there as a kid, sorting buttons by colour, while she patched up uniforms, made quilts she never quite finished, and hummed old war songs under her breath. It was the only room Dad never entered without knocking. The door creaked open like it was exhaling. Dust floated through a shaft of afternoon light. The sewing machine was still covered with the old floral cloth she used to call her inspiration blanket. And in the far corner, behind 2 stacks of quilting bins, I found it. A box, taped shut, labelled in her careful script, Evelyn. I sat cross-legged on the worn rug and peeled back the tape like I was unwrapping something sacred. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Letters I'd sent home from deployment, neatly bundled in twine. Photos of me in uniform, some I'd forgotten existed. One showed me grinning with grease-streaked cheeks beside a comms truck in Belgium. Another, more formal, with my team after the Qatar op, faces exhausted, eyes lit with survival. Beneath the photos, a manila folder. Inside, an article draft. At the top, submitted draft. Military Families Journal unsent. The title read, My Daughter, the Commander, When Quiet Strength Saves Lives. My throat tightened. I scanned the paragraphs, each one. A testament, not just to what I'd done, but to how she had seen me. Not as support staff, not as a shadow behind Derek, but as a leader, a soldier, a daughter she knew the world would try to erase and refuse to let go of. The last paragraph wasn't finished. It ended mid-sentence, because sometimes history doesn't wait to remember the pen had stopped there. I reached further into the box and found a small black flash drive taped to the inside. No label, just her handwriting on a note, play this when you're ready. Love, Mom. I borrowed the old laptop from her desk drawer, still working barely, plugged the drive in. The screen flickered, then played a short, grainy video. It was my promotion ceremony. The one I thought no one had attended. The one where my name had been called with full honours. I saw myself walk across the base stage, uniform pressed mouth tight with restraint. And behind the phone camera, Mum's soft voice whispering, "That's my girl." She didn't cheer, she didn't wave, but the camera shook a little. Her breathing hitched, and at the end when the officers clapped the screen, tilted down to her lap and I saw the tears fall. She'd been there, she'd seen, and she'd cried not because I was forgotten, but because she knew exactly what it meant to be. I let the video finish. Then I sat there in that sewing room, the light shifting across the thread baskets, and I realised something simple and seismic. My mother had never stopped seeing me. She just couldn't make the world do the same. But she'd tried, in the quietest ways. And now it was my turn. 2 months later, I stood in a glass-walled corridor overlooking Geneva. Snow dusted the hills outside like powdered sugar, softening the sharp lines of old stone. Inside, everything gleamed. Sleek floors, whispering elevators, badges clipped to suits that carried more power than flags. Lieutenant Camila Reyes waited at the end of the hall, her silhouette precise even in stillness. She was the one who had pulled my name forward, not just from a file, but from memory. The woman who had seen me command a blackout response unit in Frankfurt without ever raising my voice. "You don't lead like the rest of them," she had said over coffee on a balcony no one else used. "You lead like someone who knows silence is still a battlefield." Now she extended her hand. Ready to meet your new title, I stepped forward, boots silent on the polished floor. The badge clipped to my chest read, Commander Evelyn Rhodes, Deputy Director, Cyber Infrastructure Resilience United Nations Security Task Force. A mouthful, but every syllable carried something earned. Camille gestured toward the briefing room ahead. "We'll begin with a working session this afternoon, cross-regional risk assessments, AI weaponization trends, and national vulnerabilities." But first, she added, a small smile forming. "There's someone I want you to meet." The room we entered wasn't another high-level chamber. It was smaller, cozier. A youth mentorship seminar was underway. Girls and boys from different countries clustered in circles, laptops open problem sets scrawled across whiteboards. UN Cyber Horizons Initiative, Camille said. "We start early here. Let them dream before someone tells them not to." In the corner, a girl sat alone, maybe 12, her hair pulled into 2 neat braids, face focused on the screen in front of her. Camille tapped my arm. "That's her. Been shadowing a mentor from Estonia's digital security team." Sharp, but a little hesitant lately. I walked over, crouched beside the girl without making it formal. She didn't look up at first, just kept typing. I glanced at her screen lines of logic code forming a mock firewall. "Impressive. You're building a defense wall?" I asked softly. She finally turned eyes wary but curious. "Sort of," she said. "It's not strong enough yet. I was trying to build something like Cloud Shield, but..." Her voice trailed. I waited. She looked down. "My mum said this kind of work's not really for girls. She said it's too abstract, that I should think about something more practical. That old script. Different language, same weight." I gave a small nod. "And what do you think?" She glanced back at the code, then at me. "I think I like protecting things, especially things people don't even know are in danger." I smiled. Not the polite kind. The real kind. "Then start with one wall," I said. "Just one. Find a system, a space, a story, and promise yourself you'll guard it. Doesn't matter if anyone claps." She blinked. "But I don't know if I'm good enough." I leaned closer, dropped my voice. "You don't have to be good enough. You have to be stubborn and quiet enough to listen for the signals no one else hears." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then resumed typing, slower, steadier. Camille watched from across the room, arms folded, eyes bright. As I rose to leave, the girl turned back. "Wait," she said. "What kind of walls do you protect?" I paused. met her gaze. "The kind people forget to lock," I said. "But where everything important lives." Her eyes widened, and in that moment I saw it, the flicker of belief before the world has time to touch it. I walked back to Camille, the hum of young minds rising like soft static. She didn't ask how it went. She didn't need to. "That was the mission, wasn't it?" I said. She nodded once. "And now it's yours." I stepped out onto the balcony overlooking Lake Geneva. Twilight touched the water with silver streaks, soft but insistent. Beneath the glass railing, the lake responded quietly, rippling with purpose. I pressed both palms to the cool surface, exhaling a breath I'd held since stepping onto UN grounds. News alerts pinged on my phone, mentions of General Voss's speech of the lone figure who stood. The hashtag #Commander Rhodes was trending quietly under posts that celebrated powerful women in uncommon roles. Not viral noise, but a resonance, a ripple effect. Inside, my mind replayed those flickers of hope General Voss naming me in that hall, the young soldier saluting with gratitude the girl at the seminar programming code for an invisible wall. All of it folded into something larger than recognition. It had become presence. I opened my laptop and brought up a draft letter addressed to my father, Colonel Raymond Rhodes. The cursor blinked in the blank space I reserved for words I could never truly deliver. I wrote in a steady hand, "Father, I have come to understand that legacy is not given. It's built, removed, restored. You built a story for us that erased half of its truth. But you also gave me a name worth reclaiming. I hope one day you'll learn that silence isn't safety. It's weight." I paused. My finger hovered. The letter said what needed to be said. But would it change anything? And if it stayed unsent, did it lose meaning? I closed the document and folded it precisely into 3. Then, to my own surprise, I slipped it into a simple frame, one with a blank mat and an oval opening. The kind intended for commemorations that never happened. The kind I would fill with my own choice one day. I placed the framed letter face down on the windowsill, the blank side greeting the night. I didn't have to send it. The act of writing and reframing was the message. Morning sun lit the lake like reassurance. I stood again on that balcony, watching joggers circle the path below, and the occasional tourist pause for a photo. I slid my phone into pocket. No more alerts, no more tracking. I had accepted what history tried to withhold: my role, my story, my impact. They'd once called me support staff. Now they called me strategic lead. They once erased me from a wall. Now they referred to me as quiet power. My name was no longer a footnote. It lived in stories spoken and shared, in frameworks that shaped responses and saved lives. Tweets, think pieces, testimonials, it was there. I was there. Camille's voice floated up from below. "Meeting in 5. I nodded, took one last look at the lake, and walked back into the building to proposals and protocols and the long work ahead. That evening, back in my apartment, I finally opened the framed letter and set it upright against the empty wall. It caught the lamplight just right, the edges crisp, the handwriting steady. I stood before it, not to revisit memory, but to mark arrival. Above the letter, I placed another photo, a still from the video. My mother took, her silhouette trembling as she whispered, "That's my girl." Beneath that, I wrote in fine pen, "I remember you." On the desk, I placed a stack of printouts, the UN Mentorship Programme design outlines for a global cyber resilience initiative, and a link to the seminar video and to the wall of papers from which the hashtag threads grew. It was maps of what stood, of what could stand with quiet power. Before sleep, I typed a quick draft I would share online later. I am not a footnote. I am the chapter we write when the first ones were stolen. And this is just the beginning. Beneath it, I posted the image of the framed letter and Mum's photo. Not for applause. For audience, for witness, for the girl in Brazil, for the soldier who saluted, for my mother who listened, for myself. In the silence, so many voices found clarity. Yours might find it too. I'm not a footnote. I'm the chapter we write when the first ones were stolen. And this is just the beginning. In the silence, so many voices found clarity. Yours might find it too. I'm not a footnote. I'm the chapter we write when the first ones were stolen. And this is just the beginning. And if you've ever felt invisible in a room where you gave your whole self know this, you were never the problem. Some stories take longer to be seen, but the moment you stop waiting for permission, that's when the story finally becomes yours. If this story spoke to something in you, some quiet ache, some buried strength, stick around. Subscribe, not for me, but for the next chapter, waiting to be written may be yours.